Mastered economics, cause you took yourself from squalor. Slave. Mastered academics, cause your grace said you a scholar. Slave. Mastered Instagram, cause you can instigate a follow. Shit. Look at all these slave masters posing on your
real,
dollar.
guys.
Get it?
Look at all
This
these
is a bit
slave
overrated.
masters posing on your dollar.
Get it?
Look at all these slave masters posing on your dollar.
Get it?
Look at all
It's
these
very
slave
pretty.
masters posing on your dollar.
Get it?
Probably not the most intimate place to chit chat, but it's kind of nice. It's fresh. It feels peaceful. So we're officially in holiday season, so happy holidays. I wanted to get on camera to talk to you guys about an excerpt that I read my freshman year in college that changed my mind. It changed my life. But I'm human, so yesterday's clarity is not today's clarity. And today's clarity won't be tomorrow's clarity unless we practice it. So as much as I would like to tell you guys all that I've mastered this lesson, the truth is that I'm still practicing it every single day, learning to work through it every single day. The excerpt that I'm going to be sharing with you all is specifically on the holidays. Frederick Douglass was an American slave. The excerpt is from A Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, 1845. If you don't know who Frederick Douglass is, it's okay, stick around. I will be giving you a brief overview of who Frederick Douglass is. What Frederick Douglass shares about the holidays is something that just blew my mind. Just what Frederick Douglass saw as a slave and what he shares in his autobiography, I think is invaluable, and I think that we can all learn something about it. But if we really want to extract as much value from what he shares with us about the holidays, we need to, in my opinion, expand the notion of what it means to have a slave master. Because if you're living in America, you don't have a slave master. I mean, you could say that your boss acts like a slave master, but we do have a lot of freedom here in the United States. We have so much freedom, but if we're gonna maximize the amount of value in this excerpt, I think that we should expand the notion of what it means to have a slave master. We should also expand the notion of the holiday. The holiday can be the most obvious holidays, but it can also be our free time after work in the evening or the weekend. Without further ado, I'm going to give you a brief overview of who Frederick Douglass is, and then we're going to get into the excerpt from his autobiography. Then after that, I want to pose some questions that I'm going to try to answer to my best ability, but there are obviously questions that you can ponder on as well. Then we're going to conclude this video. All right. So who was Frederick Douglass? Frederick Douglass was born in Maryland in 1818 to the barbaric system of slavery, but that didn't stop him from teaching himself how to read and write and eventually escape slavery. He went on to become a renowned abolitionist, a famous writer, orator, diplomat, and journalist who not only fought for the freedom of enslaved people, but he was also a feminist. And it says a lot about someone who was enslaved, who wants to see other people be sovereign. And that was Frederick Douglass. He was an advocate for women's rights and the rights of other people. Fun facts, he liked to play the violin, and Frederick Douglass was also interested in photography. So now that you know that, it might not come as a surprise that this Black man was the most photographed person in the 19th century. Because this Black man, Frederick Douglass, thought that he was worth photographing. So he said that he will get photographed, and he was photographed. And I just love that. I love that about him. He went from being physically, emotionally, verbally, spiritually, financially abused to being appointed ambassador to the Republic of Haiti by U.S. President Benjamin Harrison's administration. He was also a recruiter for the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, the first regiment of African American soldiers, helping to recruit about 180,000 African Americans to help fight in the Civil War in the Union Army. He was also the Equal Rights Party nominee for Vice President of the United States in 1872. He was also appointed as the U.S. Marshal of the District of Columbia by President Hayes. But I want to be clear that I think that his legacy extends far beyond any of those flashy titles. Okay, so now that you know about Frederick Douglass has a lot to say about the holidays as a slave, and I want to share what he has to say about the holidays. So I'm going to quote from A Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, 1845.
From what I know of the effect of these holidays upon the slave, I believe them to be among the most effective means in the hands of the slaveholder in keeping down the spirit of insurrection. If the slaveholders were to abandon this practice, I have not the slightest doubt it would lead to an immediate insurrection among the slaves. These holidays serve as conductors or safety valves to carry off the rebellious spirit of enslaved humanity. If it weren't for these holidays, the slaves would be forced upon the wildest desperation, and woe would befall the slaveholder the day he ventures to remove or hinder the operation of those conductors. I warn him that if it happens, a spirit will pass through them more frightening than the worst earthquake imaginable.
We're going to continue that excerpt in just a bit, but I just want to briefly summarize what's happening in this excerpt. By teasing slaves with liberty, Frederick Douglass is suggesting that the holidays are used by the slave master to keep the spirit of insurrection at bay. None of us here are slaves, so once again, I would like to remind you all that in order for us to extract as much value from what Frederick Douglass is saying, we really should expand the notion of the slave master, because there are a lot of things that take our human energy the way that a slave master would. But we'll discuss that in just a second. Let's continue the excerpt.
The holidays are essential to the gross fraud, wrong, and inhumanity of slavery. They are professedly a custom established by the compassion of the slaveholders. But I undertake to say it is the result of selfishness and one of the grossest frauds committed upon the beat-down slave. They do not give the slaves this time because they would not like to have their work during its continuance, but because they know it would be unsafe to deprive them of it. This will be seen by the fact that the slaveholders like to have their slaves spend those days just in such a manner as to make them as glad of their ending as of their beginning. Their goal seems to be to disgust their slaves with freedom by plunging them into the lowest depths of dissipation. For instance, the slaveholders not only like to see the slave drink on his own accord, but will adopt various plans to make him drunk. One plan is to make bets on their slaves as to who can drink the most whiskey without getting drunk, and in this way, they succeed in getting whole multitudes to drink to excess. Thus, when the slave asks for virtuous freedom, the cunning slaveholder, knowing his ignorance, cheats him with a dose of vicious dissipation, artfully labeled with the name of liberty. The most of us used to drink it down, and the result was just what might be supposed. Many of us were led to think that there was little to choose between liberty and slavery. We felt, and very properly too, that we had almost as well be slaves to man as to rum. So when the holidays ended, we staggered up from the filth of our wallowing, took a long breath, and marched to the field, feeling upon the whole rather glad to go from what our masters had deceived us into a belief was freedom, back to the arms of slavery. I have said that this mode of treatment is part of the whole system of fraud and inhumanity of slavery. It is so. The mode here adopted to disgust the slave with freedom by allowing him to see only the abuse of it is carried out in other things. For instance, a slave loves sugar syrup, so he steals some. His master in many cases goes off to town and buys a large quantity. He returns, takes his whip, and commands the slave to eat the sugar syrup until the poor fellow is made sick at the very mention of it. The same mode is sometimes adopted to make the slaves refrain from asking for more food than their regular allowance. A slave runs through his allowance and applies for more. His slave master is enraged at him, but not willing to send him off without food, gives him more than is necessary and compels him to eat it within a given time. Then, if the slave protests that he cannot eat it, he is deemed satisfied neither by fullness nor by fasting, and is whipped for being impossible to please. I have an abundance of illustrations of the same principle drawn from my own observation, but think the cases I have cited sufficient. The practice is a very common one.
So I want to begin to discuss this excerpt about the holidays and what Frederick Douglass observed while he was a slave. The first question that I think will help us ponder this excerpt is, why would the slave master want the slave to abuse their freedom? Why is that beneficial for the slave master? Why would the slave master want the slave to abuse their freedom during the holidays? I encourage you all to answer that question for yourselves. I'm gonna try to answer it to the best of my ability, but if you have something different to say, I encourage you to leave a comment. The reason why the slave master finds it beneficial for the slave to abuse their freedom during the holidays is because the slave master knows that if freedom is experienced only as chaos, excess, and self-destruction, the slave will begin to associate freedom or liberty not with self-rule, not with self-autonomy, not with dignity, but with ruin, but with self-ruin. By encouraging the slave to misuse his freedom through drunkenness and dissipation, the master manipulates the slave into believing that freedom is unlivable and dangerous, rather than aspirational. The next question is, how might teasing the slaves with freedom help keep insurrection at bay? Teasing the slave with a false version of freedom keeps pressure from accumulating. Because if a slave didn't even get that freedom, he would grow so impatient with his lack of it. He would grow so impatient with his confinement that he would probably begin to rebel. He would probably begin to progress in the direction of sovereignty. But if he gets teased with a little bit of freedom here and there, these short, controlled bursts of freedom allow emotional and psychological tension to discharge without ever building into organized resistance. But you know that freedom that the slave master is providing is temporary, corrupted, supervised, followed by exhaustion and shame. So the slave then returns to bondage, not enraged, but disoriented, depleted, and doubtful, less likely to rebel because rebellion at that point feels pointless. If you're watching this video, you're probably not a slave, right? But in order for us to extract value from what Frederick Douglass is sharing about the holidays, we should begin to expand the notion of the holiday and what it means to have a slave master, especially as it regards the notion of insurrection, with regard to giving up our most earnest purpose, our most earnest calling. A lot of life happens to us, right? And we get stuck in systems that we don't necessarily agree with, we don't necessarily even like to play a part of, but because we're deep in the sauce and we get these little bursts of freedom, we don't necessarily do anything to fundamentally change how we're living, to fundamentally begin to change the way that we direct our course towards living a more fulfilled, more purposeful and meaningful life. Insurrection doesn't need to be violent or political. It can be existential. Insurrection can mean refusing to be numb, reclaiming agency over our lives, and persisting towards meaning despite the discouragement that's around us. When a person abandons their deepest purpose, not because it's impossible, but because it has been made to feel foolish, exhausting, or corrupt, that is a suppressed insurrection. I want to make things very clear with you that, first of all, I'm a proud American. Our country is not perfect. There are so many flaws with our country, but also our country has provided us with so many freedoms that never before have we been able to have. You know, I'm first generation American, and I know that this country is not perfect whatsoever. Still, there are systems in place that allow us to be free. Our systems here in the United States, they're not perfect. They're far from perfect. Yet I think that there are systems in place within the United States and within our government and our institutions that are there for most people to take advantage of if they so place their attention in such a way as to move forward to creating change. Most people don't accumulate the spirit necessary to start that change, to begin moving towards more meaningful action. This past week, we just heard that the FBI prevented a terrorist attack by this organization that I won't mention the name of, but they're a terrorist organization. It seems like they're pro-anarchy. I'm not suggesting that people become so impatient that they do the irrational thing, because those people, the same people that were plotting against the American people by trying to bomb various places here in California during New Year's Eve, those same people could have organized in more productive ways to implement the change that they really wanted to see. Unfortunately, they fail to understand that we do have systems in the United States that could create more meaningful action. Organizing such transformative change is a lot harder than going and bombing places. And that's disgusting, and I wholeheartedly disagree with that. And my video is not about creating that kind of insurrection that's gonna kill innocent people, that kind of insurrection that's going to lead to more chaos. It's easier to complain about how our systems are so corrupt and we really need to do something about it. But then every single weekend, what are you doing with your time? Are you investing in the transformative change that you really want to see? Here's an example. Let's say that you really are trying to spend more time with your children, right? And weekend comes around, you're like, yes, I get 2 days with my children to play, to actually speak to them more. I hardly see them because they're in public education and I'm working. That little freedom that you get during the weekend with your children, maybe that's actually stopping you from taking your kids out of the public education system, homeschooling your kids. You know, the United States allows you, we're a free society. You can homeschool your children. Oh, but what am I going to do with work? You will figure that out. But the reason why so many people stay stuck and complain about the systems that they're taking part of is because we get these little glimpses of freedom that unfortunately we're not using to create more sovereignty in our lives. Why? Why do we do that to ourselves? I'm not talking down to you. This entire excerpt is a reminder to myself. We all have different slave masters. Sometimes I battle with a new one every other week. So again, this is a reminder. I'm not trying to talk down to anyone. I'm sharing something that I believe is a great reminder to myself and also something that I find very valuable. The next question that I hope you all will ponder about as it regards this excerpt is, why would being a slave to alcohol or substances make us feel that we might as well be slave to man as to rum? I'll ask that again. Why would being a slave to alcohol or substances make us feel that we might as well be slaves to man as to rum? That can be because loss of self-mastery doesn't feel any different from external domination. If a person cannot govern their own impulses, then freedom becomes hollow. Does that make sense? Let's say you're in a very unhealthy relationship with a person and you feel very consumed by that relationship. And when you're apart from that relationship, maybe you're struggling with substance abuse disorder. At the end of the day, because of that inability to master yourself during the time when you're apart from that relationship, you feel that you might as well go back into that low quality, unhealthy relationship, because what happens when I'm apart from that person? I'm giving in to my base desires. I'm not mastering myself, my sovereignty, to the extent that it begins to make no difference whether or not I'm owned by that relationship or by this substance. And so that's why being a slave to these substances, again, we can have various slave masters, can make us want to just give in to any slave master. The idea becoming, if I'm ruled by appetite, then I'm not free, even if no one owns me. So addiction collapses the moral difference between external chains and internal ones. When agency is gone, when you're apart from your job that you don't like, who holds the chain secondary? Is it you? Is it you really governing your time and your attention? Or is it placed elsewhere? Do we have a secondary slave master? And again, I don't want to paint this as if having a job means you have a slave master. That's not what I'm saying. As Dr. James Hollis has said, it's not about what you do, it's about what it is in service to. And I want to remind people of that. I'm not suggesting that you just go jobless. But I may be suggesting that if it's something that's required of you to move forward and progress towards your most earnest purpose. How can we expand the notion of the slave master's plot to make the slaves drunk so that we can apply this to the indulgences that are widely available and accessible to us today? Today's whiskey is not necessarily alcohol or even substances. It can include endless scrolling on social media, on your previous text messages, on your pictures and videos. It can include pornography. It can include ultra-processed foods. My favorite slave master. It's a joke, but I do battle with that. It could be algorithmic outrage. How many people are just so enraged because they're in little silos on social media that are just making them so mad. Without realizing it, they're spending so much time on that platform. It could be dopamine maximizing entertainment. It can also be consumer excess masked by self-care. And I really would like to make a video on the hyper commercialization of wellness. It could be the social obligations that you don't even want to go to. There's always something to celebrate, right? That could be your slave master. It could be the fact that there is always some little gathering to go to every Sunday, whatever. Instead of you actually honing in to what your earnest purpose and desire is. Like, let's say you're busy all week because you're working, and the time that you're not working, people are calling you to do this, or that. Well, there are times where you're gonna need to stand your ground and remember that you need to be more sovereign with your free time. It's really hard. It's really hard. These indulgences are often marketed as freedom, but yet they're engineered to exhaust attention, undermine discipline, reduce long-term thinking, replace meaning with stimulation. Like the holidays described in Frederick Douglass's excerpt, they simulate liberty, but quietly disable self-rule. I want to linger on this for a moment.
I want to make sure that people understand that I'm not here trying to judge anyone for having a cup of wine, for drinking during the holidays, for celebrating during the holidays. I'm not here trying to judge. I'm simply posing questions that I want people to ponder about with regard to whether or not they're spending the holidays, their weekends as well, and their afternoons during their free time in such a way that they are truly doing it with their sovereignty. They're doing it in a genuine way. They don't feel peer pressured to spend their time a certain way or to spend their dollars a certain way. Money is energy. And the slave masters that we have in today's world, they want you to spend your precious dollar. They want you to spend your precious energy. And think about how overconsumption can lead people in the direction of being confined to a job that they might not necessarily like. If you take in overconsumption loops because of holidays, because of celebrations, because of weekend social pressures, you could be overspending and then feeling like you have to return to a place that you might dislike that you call your occupation. Because at that point, you need to get paid more. And ultimately, you don't end up saving enough. And this has wider implications. We live very fragmented social lives. We don't have tribes and community the way that we might have before. And especially for people who have been historically disenfranchised, who don't have the same social and financial resources or networks that people with more privilege have had. Perhaps instead of coming together with their brotherhood to build something together with their accumulated savings or resources, they get stuck in consumer loops that keep them from progressing with perhaps savings that they could invest in a joint company or in a joint effort. And that can be even compounded by the fact that sometimes the same social networks could be addicted to certain substances. And you ain't no monk because you don't drink. Asceticism does not make one inherently virtuous, and I understand that. Being drug-free does not make one inherently virtuous. But what I'm saying is that if you're addicted, it could be addiction to food, it could be addiction to substances, addiction to clothes, addiction to keeping up with trends with a certain aesthetic that could keep you living paycheck to paycheck, only to afford this cheap and short-lived holiday.
The next question that I want to briefly discuss is, what would the slave masters plot to disgust the slave with too much freedom, too much syrup, cause the slave to believe about freedom? And what would it cause the slave to believe about himself? What would the slave masters plot to disgust the slave with too much pleasure, too much syrup, cause the slave to believe about liberty? And what would it cause the slave to believe about himself? By showing the slave that he would only abuse his freedom, the slave master attempts to confuse the slave into thinking that freedom is excessive, sickening, and dangerous, something that overwhelms rather than elevates. And what would it cause the slave to believe about himself, to see only the abuse of freedom? It would cause him to believe that he's incapable of moderation, discipline, or responsibility. And that's the deepest cruelty of this strategy. It convinces the oppressed person that they are unworthy of freedom, not merely deprived of it. It reminds me of the fight of ultra-processed foods, right? And Ozempic. Since I can't control myself, right, with these ultra-processed foods, they're so addictive that what do? I begin to believe that I cannot handle consuming these ultra-processed addictive foods make me feel that I cannot handle my freedom. I can't handle this indulgence to the extent that maybe I need Ozempic. Maybe I can't trust myself, so I need Ozempic. I need another slave master. And so we trade one for the other. Again, this passage is more than just about slavery. It's about how systems maintain control by corrupting desire, weaponizing pleasure, and teaching people to confuse indulgence with liberty. Let's continue this conversation. I want to touch on why there are so many slave masters. So we live in a capitalist society. We also have socialism embedded into our society. That's what taxes are. Yes, that's what taxes are. It's partial socialism. Goes for paying for our roads, our military. There are aspects of America that have socialism embedded into them. A lot of people misunderstand what capitalism is, so I'm going to give you the definition.
Capitalism is an economic system in which private individuals or businesses own and control the means of production, such as land, factories, tools, and capital, and goods and services are produced for profit and exchanged through markets. With regard to what Frederick Douglass has shared, capitalism becomes the modern architecture that allows the slave masters to exist without calling themselves such. They're not literally slave masters, but in a way, they sort of behave as such. Douglass explains that holidays were not kindness, but safety valves, a calculated release of pressure that preserved the system while giving the illusion of freedom. The slaves were permitted momentary excess so that they would not revolt against permanent deprivation. At its most perverted edge, capitalism can reduce human beings to cost centers, productivity units, or liabilities. These modern masters may not own bodies outright, but they extract time, energy, health, and attention in ways that leave people economically trapped. Just as holidays simulated freedom for the enslaved, modern systems offer consumer choice instead of economic mobility, hustle culture instead of ownership, credit instead of capital, entertainment instead of rest. People feel free because they can choose how to spend what little remains, while the underlying structure remains untouched. This parallels Douglass's safety valve, but updated to what's happening in our modern world. Slavery then required visible violence, but modern exploitation is bureaucratized and outsourced. Algorithms replace overseers, contracts replace chains, debt replaces whips, and the distance allows these modern slave masters, corporations, investors, executives to benefit without witnessing suffering, which makes the system morally easier to sustain. Modern capitalism excels at creating dependence without legal ownership. Wages are insufficient to save oftentimes. There are benefits tied to employment. So, most people, unless you have a job, don't have health insurance. And housing and healthcare is priced beyond reach. You've got these corporations that are constantly buying homes and renting them out. Instead of allowing those homes to be owned by real people, they're being owned by corporations who are trying to exploit the system that is there for them to exploit. And the fear of job loss just enforces compliance. In Douglass's terms, this keeps people neither full nor fasting, never secure enough to resist, never starving enough to revolt. Douglass exposes how slavery cloaked itself in compassion, and sometimes modern capitalism cloaks exploitation in opportunity, meritocracy, personal responsibility, or choice. When people fail under the system, blame is individualized, never structural. This preserves the innocence of the modern master. And I should say modern masters. That's why we have so many modern masters. By the way, I would much rather have the option to pick my master than to be given the ultimate master, right? You'll hear me say in a bit that I am pro-conscious capitalism, but I will say that there's a lot of flaws. In addition, the people that had capital first, who had capital first? The people that colonized, whoever got here first and exploited this land for resources, are the people who had the means of production first, such as land, factories, tools, and capital. They were the ones that fundamentally have created the systems that are now in place today, or at least a lot of what we have today is the residual of their investments. And I'm not trying to throw out the baby with the bathwater. What I'm saying is that we need to begin to fundamentally change what we were inherited, these systems that we were inherited that aren't necessarily working very well for many people. But I also want to point out that yes, we do have a personal responsibility to pick our masters and to not give our dollars in such a way we are becoming more enslaved to these masters. And who's these masters? You pick your master, and that's the beauty of it. That's why I do appreciate capitalism, because at least we get to pick who our masters are. Unfortunately, we're socially engineered to make it very easy to pick the worst ones. Unfortunately, we are socially engineered by technology and commercialization to make the silliest of choices when it comes to picking where our dollars, where our attention goes.
I am pro-conscious capitalism, 100%. I think conscious capitalism, and obviously having aspects of socialism embedded into American society, is what's going to bring us more conscious living. I don't think it's going to solve everything, but I think it would be beneficial for us to start questioning every single business, every single thing that we own as a potential slave master. And that includes things like gym wear. It could include things like wellness. It could include things like the people you follow on Instagram. Do you ever notice that no gym influencer is ever like, you have enough. You have enough to get healthy. You don't need more gym wear. You have enough. You don't need the newest collection. You don't. Have you ever heard that from a gym influencer? Probably not. Have you ever heard marketing like, you don't need more celebrations. You need to go and find your purpose. Think of the garments that we wear. Have you ever heard Adidas say, you don't need another shirt. You don't need more swagger. You have enough swagger to go and live out your purpose. Have you heard Instagram say, you've spent enough time here. You can get the f out and go find your purpose. Have you ever heard Instagram say, you have enough to live a great life. You don't need to be more connected. Because let's be real, most of this isn't connection, is it? Me speaking to the camera on the street, this is not connection. But I will say, okay, that if my videos are ever making you feel like you're further away from your purpose, if consuming more of me means becoming less of you, get out of here. You don't need me. Get out of here. You've had enough of me. You have had enough of me. You know, your slave master could be a place as well. That keeps you tethered. Oh gosh, am I projecting? Sheesh. A lot of holidays, whether they're religious or not, become about consumerism. And for families, especially for working class families, sometimes it can feel exhausting to the point that they get glad when these holidays are over. And it reminds us of that excerpt in Frederick Douglass's autobiography when he says that the slaves feel rather glad to go back to the arms of slavery after feeling so disgusted with what they confused was liberty. Who else is a sucker for the lights, though? I think I am. It looks so whimsical. It almost makes you forget that you're not doing what you really want to do Monday through Friday. And every other time it's not a holiday. Ooh, that was fun. Should we do it again? Oh, ooh, yay. Holiday, woo. beautiful. It's so beautiful. It's so romantic. Oh my goodness. Look at the tree. Just screams possibility. Oh my goodness. It's beautiful. It's so inspiring. Hey, these lights are blinding, huh? You want to people watch? Should we people watch? Nah, I don't want to people watch. I wish you all happy holidays. But I also want you to remember that you can do whatever you want with your freedom. You can do something that brings you more meaning with your freedom. That's every single evening and every single weekend, every single holiday that you're free. Why do y'all be like that? You ain't teaching anybody a lesson, okay? You think people are gonna go home and be like, someone beeped at me, I will be better. Unless you're preventing an accident. Why are you beeping? Why are you beeping like that? That's obnoxious. We should probably go somewhere quieter. You have to start there. I mean, I am in front of the station, so it's kind of my fault there.
Mastered economics cause you took yourself from squalor. Slave. Mastered academics cause your grade said you a scholar. Slave. Mastered Instagram cause you can instigate a follow. Shit. Look at all these slave masters posing on your dollar. Get it?
Look at all these slave masters posing on your dollar. Look at all these slave masters posing